Let's see, call to order. Why don't we just go around for the roll call?
Nathan Long, Planning Commission.
Susan Waukee, City Council.
Roger Spriggs, City Council.
Riley Hoagland, Planning Commission.
Kip Ward, City Council.
Doug Bryson, Planning Commission.
Barry Cunningham, Planning Commission.
Dick Anderson, City Council.
Deanna Hickson, Planning Commission.
Chester Norika, City Council.
Steve Griffiths, Planning Commission.
Ron Chandler, City Manager.
Bruce Robinson, Planning Commission. You want to take it from me? Yes, would you please?
Okay, it's Groundhog today, so we're in the second cycle of this loop, for those of you who have seen the movie. Anyways, thank you again for coming. Tonight, we hope to, this is a follow-up from our previous meeting. There were several items that came up, and questions that were asked, and follow-up that you asked the staff to do. What I really hope to do tonight is really to get through two of the topics that we have. We can talk about others if you'd like to, but there's two main ones that seem to have all the questions centered around them. The first was accessory use, and what other zoning techniques are other communities using as they deal with VRDs. And the second is the occupancy level for the VRDs. If we can get through those two, then I think we're in great shape. The next step following tonight's meeting is that next Monday this will be on the City Council agenda for them to vote on whether or not they want to initiate the process of formally creating the ordinances. So with that, we'll just jump right in and go forward. Again, I just wanted to remind us that the guiding principles that we have been using in coming up with these ordinances, the first is to keep it simple, which is easy to understand, easy to follow, and easy to enforce. We try to recognize the changes that have occurred in Lincoln City over the past several years. Protecting the neighborhoods, you're introducing a commercial use into a residential zone that certainly has an impact on those neighborhoods. Implement the will of the council, and finally comply with Oregon laws. That one will become important as we go through a little bit of discussion as I throw out a couple of other ideas. Okay, any questions on that? So following the meeting that we held 2 weeks ago, you essentially had asked us, if you eliminated accessory use, what are some of the other techniques that communities are using in order to deal with vacation rentals? Now, it's important to recognize that for every one of these, the end goal is the same, and that is to control the growth and the impact of VRDs in the community. They're just different techniques on how to do that. So I started with the Newport model. There's been a lot of discussion about Newport. Newport has unlimited nightly rentals. They can be anywhere in the city. They don't have any density limitation. They don't have distance limitations, and they don't have a cap on VRDs. Okay. It is the most liberal of the VRD ordinances. Okay. Any questions on Newport?
Do we know the number of VRDs that they have?
They have about 150. About 150 and about twice the square mileage of Lincoln City.
And essentially no control.
Well, their control is through licensing. Okay, and so they do have standards for licensing, but as far as things pertaining to the control of time limitations or density or the number, no, they do not. Yes?
They do have occupancy.
They do have occupancy, yes. Yes, they do. Any other questions?
And the population is a couple, 2,000 or 3,000 more than ours as well.
It is. Okay, the next.
If I might, their size is twice as ours.
Yes, the square mileage is twice. Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. Yachats also is a city that we looked at, and they do not. They also are similar to Newport.
Do they have commercial standards? Newport, that's in it. if they're in if it's a full-time BRD?
You mean it's similar to what a hotel has?
Right.
Construction standards.
No, their health and safety standards, building standards would be closer to ours. Okay, the next one that we wanted to bring up is the Cannon Beach model, which is perhaps the most complicated of these. Cannon Beach actually they've classified BRDs into two groups. The first group is called the transient rental occupancy BRDs. Now, as I understand how that worked, is that when these laws came into place, there were existing BRDs. And so these BRDs have an unlimited nightly rental. Okay? They are not permitted in all zones. They are not permitted in most of the residential zones. They are permitted in their multifamily residential and commercial zones. Unless they were grandfathered. Okay, those were the existing ones. They do have a cap on the number of transient rental occupancy BRDs. That cap is 92. To my knowledge, from what I've been able to find, they have not reviewed that or changed that list. Now, what happens in Cannon Beach is that they started with 92. Their VRD licenses, like ours, are not transferable. So when somebody sells their property or transfers their property, then that license is gone. And someone else can then apply to get the one of the 92. If you receive that license from that point on, you're not one of the original 92. It's a 5-year license. It expires in 5 years. Anyone who is wishing to obtain this type of a license goes on to a waiting list that is chosen each year by a lottery. Their clerk told me that they have about 5 or 6 the licenses that they give out. The second type of vacation rental occupancy, or VRD, is called their vacation rental occupancy VRD. It, like the one before, is not permitted in all zones. Again, it's only permitted in the RM and a commercial zone called the C1 zone. In this case, they are limited on the rental frequency or the number of nights the VRD could be rented. And what that is that you can only have one rental event every 14 days. Now, a rental event is considered to be a rental to somebody or a group of somebody. And that can be a night, it can be 2 nights, it can be 14 nights, as long as it's the same somebody. So in other words, if I were to rent to you, to Mr. Apicello, and he stays 2 nights, I cannot rent again for another 12 days. Okay, and each 14-day period begins when the rental occurs. Okay, now I asked, how do you enforce such a thing? And she said 2 ways. One, neighbors are pretty good at ratting out each other, was the one comment, and that's a quote. And the second is that they do audits each year. Not an audit of all of the VRDs, but they'll have a random audit that they will do each year. And then they will calculate to determine if somebody is violating that standard. Yes, sir.
How many of this type are there?
She did not give me that number, so I don't know that. I'll find that out and let you know.
Well, I was just trying to compare it to the other type. And the other was, is this a free-for-all? Can everybody with a license do this? Or
Within the zone.
Within the zone.
If they're within the zone, they can apply for it, but there's a cap of 92. There is a waiting list of 147 on the first one.
No, on this one.
Oh, on the second? No, there's no waiting list on that one. Anybody within the zone can obtain that VRD if they meet all the other requirements. Yes, sir.
How does that zone, the second one, compare to residential zones in Cannon Beach?
It is a multifamily residential and a commercial zone. They do not permit it in their regular single-family residential zones. Okay. One of the things to note as you go through that last point that I just made, that is the traditional zoning approach where use is permitted in one zone and it's not permitted in another. Any other questions on the Cannon Beach model?
I just got confused. It looks like neither of them permit BRDs in residential zones.
That's right. That's right. The language from the ordinance is they're not permitted in the RBL, R1, or RBL, RL, R1, R2, R3, and RAM zones. They're only permitted in the RM and C1 zone.
Unless they were grandfathered and they still own that license.
Exactly.
Do we know if they have any additional rules as to parking regulations and garbage?
Yes, yes. They have all the same type of rules that we do as far as nuisances, parking, local contacts, and so forth.
And that's Yachts and Newport as well?
Yes.
So when the grandfathered BRD comes to a point where they want to sell it, it goes back into the pool, or can they sell that as a BRD?
No, the license is not transferred.
I see, okay.
What the interesting approach was, one of the interesting approaches to me on that first one was the fact that their license is only good for 5 years. So at the end of 5 years, somebody's going to be rotating. Their license is going to expire, and then they have to go back into the waiting list.
But not the grandfathered ones.
But not the grandfather.
Right.
And ultimately, when you project that out over time, all of the grandfather ones will disappear, and there will be 92 permitted nightly rentals that have licenses good for 5 years.
A lot of the dialogue throughout this process has been about sort of downzoning, what would happen. A lot of the heat and fury about it has been the notion that somebody could lose the ability to operate as a BRD. Did they make any remarks about that?
No, other than simply the statement that they knew up front that this was the same levels.
When they had that lawsuit, were they, the VRD's owners and the city, when it went, didn't they find that it was not in fact a downzoning as long as they didn't make it a mini motel? So if it was just at home without any other alterations, it was in fact not a down zoning, correct?
They found it was not a taking. The cases were about, was it a taking? Did you take all reasonable beneficial use of the property by saying you can't have a BRD there?
Okay.
And the court said, no, you can still have a residence there. And so you haven't taken away all use of the property.
Right. So it was not a down zone.
Not a taking.
And I didn't mean downzoning when I actually meant taking.
Any other questions on the Cannon Beach model?
I wanted to ask, when you're saying that they had a court decision then already on this particular issue.
We cited the Cannon Beach cases, both the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court, in the findings for the adoption of the ordinances in 2014, because we had a lot of people get up at the podium and say, this is a constitutional taking, I'm going to sue you. And they said, Cannon Beach prohibited them, and did grandfather some, did do this lottery thing, but just because you're not going to have the ability to do a VRE doesn't mean you don't have the ability to use your residence as a residence. So the court said you have reasonable economic use of your property. That was 20 years ago.
Based on having the grandfather going on, though, too.
Well, their ordinances were upheld against a challenge that they constituted a taking.
Is that like the right or the privilege to use it as a business?
No, the Constitution says the government can't take your property without paying you just compensation. So usually we all think of that in terms of eminent domain. That I come along and say, "Oh, I'm gonna take your property here and put a street here. Too bad And, well, you have a right to compensation, just compensation, but that's been extended through the case law to apply to regulations that go too far. So your regulation says you have property in its wetlands, and you can't develop your wetlands at all. Well, if you can't have any use of your property, that may constitute use by the regulation. Then, the cases are like the Dunes cases in North Carolina, where, sorry, you can't develop at all. And then they say, sorry, that's a denial of all reasonable economic use of the property. It's a taking. You've taken your property rights, and the government's taken them from you by means of this regulation. Now, in the case of Cannon Beach, you come in and argue that, I have a right to do a VRD, and the answer is no. The government can reasonably regulate a business like this, and you're not denied all reasonable economic use of your property because you can still use it as a home.
This comes back to one of the very fundamental principles of zoning. You have a right to do something with your property. You don't have a right to do everything with your property. And that's where zoning comes into place. You can have a home here, but you can't have a smokestack. All right, any other questions on the Cannon Beach model? Okay. The next is the Manzanita model, which caps the total number of VRDs in residential zones. They have 3 residential zones that we were able to identify, and they put a cap of 17.5% of the dwelling residents within that zone. So in other words, if there's 1,000 dwelling units, then it's 175 units that would be VRDs that you could have. Of all of the approaches, this is probably the simplest. It's probably the easiest to understand, the easiest to follow, and the easiest to enforce.
Do they have other rules and regulations as well?
They also have, all of them have other rules and regulations. Yes.
Do they have a rationale for how they came up with that percentage?
We have not heard. I don't know the answer.
They keep a waiting list, don't they?
Yeah. Any of these that have restrictions on the numbers are going to have waiting lists. Like I said, this one, as far as a land use strategy or technique, is probably the easiest to understand, easiest to follow, easiest to enforce. It's enforced at licensing time.
When you get a license on them, you keep it for lifetime? Or as long
No,
as you
it's not
continue?
transferable. Did we find any of them that were transferable?
No.
I don't think any of the cities
Well,
have
it's not a time
licensing.
limitation either.
No, didn't see a time limitation.
Unlimited nights in Manzanita?
There's nothing in the ordinance about the number of nights.
Following our meeting, I'm going to turn to these folks for help. Because following our meeting, I had said, you take a city, you take a city, you take a city, and our staff was terrific in helping me put all of this together. Okay. Any other questions about the Manzanita model? Okay. The next one is the Seaside model. This was an interesting one. In this one, the VRDs are limited based on their proximity to other VRDs. They're permitted in some, but not in all residential zones. In Seaside, they establish a minimum distance between VRDs. Essentially what it is that if you look at the subject piece of property, within 100 feet of that, there cannot be more than 20% of the houses have a VRD.
Even in a commercial zone?
This is in residential zones.
This is only residential.
This is residential zones. Yes.
Bend has a very similar policy to them as well.
The other one that we found that had that same type of policy was Bandon, and theirs is within 250 feet and cannot be more than 30%, and theirs, it looks like theirs is in their commercial zones. Okay. So there is a cap of 20%. They also use accessory use, which is the exact same definition that we have.
Do they have a limit on the accessory use? The number of days it can be rented?
It's the same as ours. Incidental and subordinate to the main use of the building.
They don't have like 30.
No.
Did they express any concern about how they enforce that?
You know, he said it's never been a question or an issue here.
And never enforced.
Never. And that's why.
But never challenged either?
He said it's that question of accessory use has not ever come up.
Any other questions on the Seaside model? Okay. The next is the Lincoln City model. VRDs are permitted in residential and commercial zones. Within the residential zones, they are limited by accessory use, which, as you know, is defined as incidental and subordinate to the main use of the building. And then as of last year, we also have the vacation rental zone. Again, with all of these, there are other regulations, landscaping, and all of those other things that affect it. But we're, for the time period, just focusing on the accessory use types of regulations. Any questions on our current ordinance?
Who's the one that called on this one?
Who's the one that was? I think we all know this one. Okay. And then finally, as we discussed, the zoning model is what I called it. And that is the light green, okay, is essentially your commercial areas where we allow unlimited time and unlimited ownership. The darker green, okay, is mostly your R15 zone. And in that one, the proposal is to permit without time limitation, but with ownership limitation. You can't have ownership in more than one VRD. The orange area, okay, which is mostly but not exclusively west of 101, and if you draw straight up with Road's End, it's on the west side of, or east side of Road's End, east side of 101. VRDs would be permitted with time limitation and with ownership limitation. And then finally, these darker areas are where VRDs are not permitted. That's mostly open space, parks, a couple of industrial areas. And so that's the proposal that we had brought before you at our last meeting. Now, there's one other. Bandon, Cannon Beach, and Seaside all use this model to some extent. In other words, they have areas where they do not permit VRDs. In our case, it's not that we're prohibiting them, but there is a time limitation in some areas. Now, over the last 2 weeks, I've received emails, calls, discussions with some of you and with some residents. And so it led me to want to bring up one other idea for discussion. Again, as we looked at the idea of keeping it simple, is there something else that we should be recommending or should be discussing? And there's one that I want to bring up, and that is a cap. To get your general sense or a discussion that within the area, so these, either just this one or these two, not kind of focusing on just this one, where there is a VRDs permitted without time limitation and with ownership limitation. I wanted to bring up the idea to discuss, should there be a cap on the total number?
Do we know the total number now?
Of VRDs?
Correct.
Total for the city is about, is just under 500. At my last count, about 40 or so of those are within the in the orange area, the R175, which we would grandfather in, so 460 or so.
So what is the percentage we have now, like in the light green area? Do we have that number? VRDs compared to residents?
Compared to that 17.5.
Yeah, when you look at the residential areas, the area where they would be limited or permitted with a time limitation makes up about, of the lots, makes up about 53% of the lots. Now, and about 47% would fall in these other zones, and I've included Road's End in that calculation. Now, it's important for me to note that that is lots. city owns 360 acres, which is within that orange zone that is not divided up for lots right now. Okay, so this is the buildable lots or lots that have buildings on them already.
You know the total number of homes in Lincoln City?
There's about 6,000 dwelling units in the city, and about 3,500 of them are single-family homes.
Do we know the number of homes in the dark green area?
I can tell you based on that.
That's the one that we were going to be limiting.
Give me just a second to find that. I've got it in here.
That would be the contentious zone.
Okay. Now these numbers are really quick and dirty. I asked Sandy if she could pull these off in a very short period of time, and so there's some adjustment, but they give us a pretty good idea. In the Rhodes End area, there's 903 lots. In the R15, there's 1,939. In the VR, it's approximately 100.
Those again?
Rhodes End is about, I'm going to round these. There's about 900.
Okay.
The R15, about 1,940. Again, these are rounded numbers. So the VR zone is 130. The R175 zone, so we've now moved into the orange area, is 1,700 and 1,800 roughly. In the R110 zone, there's 45. And in the RM zone, there's about 1,100. And in the RR zone, there's about 420.
Those are lots, not houses.
No, that's lots and houses.
Well, I mean, it's just the number of lots that are.
Yeah, they may have a house on them, they may not.
Okay, but we don't know the number of VRDs then in those areas.
Actually, we know how many VRDs.
Yes, we do.
So many houses.
Yes, we do. So in our last discussion, when we looked at Rhodes End, we had 178. Okay, in the green area, we had 178. The remaining ones were spread out through the other zones.
So in the R5, we have 178?
Yeah.
R15 is 178?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So that sounds similar to that 1 and 6.
That's light green.
So like 150.
So part of tonight's purpose is just informational. Get any comments. It's a work meeting, so we're not voting on anything. Again, as I'm getting ready to go to the council to talk about initiating this process, and any questions or comments that you have pertaining to this, and also looking at the idea of camp. The one thing that I want to avoid doing, okay, is getting down into the details of the percentage, the numbers, things like that. There's work that I need to do with Mr. Apicella, Mr. Townsend, to talk about how you do it and how you do it legally and comply with the Oregon laws, which is one of our guiding principles. So I'm not prepared to say this is the methodology we'd use. It's really more to stay on the concept level to get any questions or ideas that you have.
Okay. The cap would exclude those that already have it, correct?
No, it's not. No, not necessarily. Not necessarily.
Not counting grandfather then?
Not necessarily. Again, that's got to be fleshed out in more of the discussion. So it could be, it may not be.
Now, with a cap, and you get rid of accessory use, what's going to protect some of the smaller other residential areas that don't really have VRDs in them now, that a lot of the neighborhoods don't want to have, or that we might not want to have? Where's the protection?
If they are within the zones that we've discussed, they would be able to have a VRD.
So there is no protection in R5.
Well, other than the cap we're talking about.
Right, but if they're still available, the cap hasn't been hit yet. I mean, I've heard a lot of concerns about, BRDs moving too far away from commercial areas, deeper into residential zones. So, is there protection you could put on that? Or?
It's interesting to know. Well, this gets to the other concept that we were talking about. If you eliminate the accessory use for the area that is essentially west of 101 and Roads End, are there other mechanisms you can use to offset that? And that's where you get into the things like the occupancy, the other standards that we have, the other enforcement procedures that we're proposing as a means to protect the neighborhoods from the effects of the BRDs coming through.
Plus caps and density.
Now, one thing I would, yes, exactly. Now, one thing I would add into this is that if a cap was to be considered and to be adopted, I would also recommend that it be required to have a regular review every 3 to 5 years. The best time to do it is when you review your general plan to see if it working the way that you hoped it was working. Are your premises for having that cap still the same? Are they still valid? So I think that having a regular review makes a lot of sense to me. And like I said, the best time to do it is when we review our general plan.
There's no time limit on the license itself, right?
No.
I don't see how you can include the existing BRDs in the cap. I just feel like we need to grandfather the existing BRDs and go forward.
Grandfather them for what?
For what they're operating now.
Okay, well, think about it. Let's say there's 500 BRDs. Under the proposal that we have, they'll have unlimited rental nights. Okay, they'll be licensed. They won't lose their license unless they sell their property, which is what they have now. It's not transferable. They won't be able to own more than one, which they can't now anyways. They're not losing anything. When you talk about grandfathering, you're grandfathering because they're going to lose something. They're not losing anything. They're actually gaining something. What they're gaining is unlimited rental of their properties. So when you say grandfather, the question that I have to ask back is grandfathering them for what? Because they're not losing.
That would be in the case if you said, we will grandfather all residential BRDs now, but going forward we won't allow any more. And then after 5 years, let's say there's a license, you would grandfather those then.
I still don't see the grandfather. The only grandfathering I see is the ones that are in the R175 zone and the RM zone, because now they do have a much greater limitation, whatever you're going to define accessory use as. But if I'm an existing licensing holder and I'm in this green area, okay, I'm still licensed. I can still rent as many nights as I want for as long as I hold my license. The only way I'm going to lose my license is if I do something that violates the ordinances and causes me to get it. So I don't know what you're actually grandfathering.
Right. I think one thing is what you're saying assumes that the cap is equal to or greater than the number of BRDs you have now. If it is, then there's nothing to be grandfathered. If it's lower, then presumably some of them would be grandfathered.
And I've been working, that's a good point, because I've been working off the assumption it would be higher than what we have now. Then you don't even have to deal with grandfather.
You would have to prohibit all BRDs. All BRDs are now prohibited, and then the existing BRDs would be arguably grandfathered legal non-conforming uses.
The problem that creates is that you've just added a layer of complexity. If you were to simply say that the number is 525, or 550, or 575, or 600, or 800, whatever number you want to use, and whatever justification you have for coming up with that number, all of the people that are existing BRD owners are in that category and are taken care of. Yes.
Let's see, I think the R5 zone is still a residential zone.
It is.
And the purpose of that zone is to stabilize the residential characters of the zone. So I think we need to be very protective of the residents, full-time residents who live west of 101 in the R5 zone. And so if we get rid of accessory use, and I'm not sure we want to do that, we do need a cap, and that cap has got to be pretty close to what exists right now, so we don't get more DRDs in the R15 zone, because it's probably pretty capped out right now.
Yeah, I was curious, Ron. How do you look at the properties that are held in trust and they'll basically never change ownership because they're held in trust by a family and they already have an existing license and it's grandfathered in, so that piece of property is never going to be changing ownership?
I think you addressed that, didn't you?
The other Richard answered that.
Well, I mean, there is, trusts are intended to continue, but there are trusts that get terminated for one reason or another. Houses burn down, people decide to do different things with the property. But yeah, we do have a number of properties that are in trust, and I believe that it's tied to the life of the owner, I think.
Yeah, I think the trust can be just for the benefit of the owner and the owner's spouse or other survivor, but it doesn't go beyond that.
Yeah, I think the existing terms of the ordinance limited that, as Richard stated.
So you are having regulations that are specifically to properties that are in trust, family trust?
Well, since 2009, I think this regulation has been in place that prohibits the transfer and specifically addresses transfers within trust. Now, we tried to tweak it to address other things like land sale contracts last time, and those ordinances were rejected by the voters. But we regulate, normally we don't regulate a form of ownership, but or transferability, but in this case, it implements the accessory use limit.
Well, I know of a property out in Rhodes Inn that's been in a family trust since probably, I guess, the time it was built. And over this period of time, there have been upwards of, I'm going to say, 30 or 40 people that are associated with this trust, and it's never left the trust covered.
Well, since it's in Rhodes Inn, it's just recently come under our jurisdiction. So for a year, they've gotten a license. So it hasn't come up yet. There hasn't been a transfer that we've been notified of.
There is one thing I want to bring up. If this is a route that you want to pursue, okay, there is something I didn't bring up when you talk about a cap. One of the things I've heard over the course of the last year is that our hotel industry has not grown. I mean, not had it in years, growth in our hotel industry. That statement isn't completely accurate. It's accurate when you're only talking about hotels. But if you're talking about the lodging industry, you're talking about room capacity, the number of rooms that are available. It's grown significantly, but it's grown through VRDs, okay? And that has added a huge financial impact to the city. The best example I have is that a year ago when I started working here and I was on the radio, they asked me what restaurant I had been to. And I'd only been to one at that point. It was my first week here. So my wife and I decided we were going to try to go to all of the restaurants because we started getting invitations. Well, last week was my year anniversary, and Liz and I had been to 50 of them. And we're about 4 or 5 short. There's no way a city of 8,000 people should have 50 restaurants. It is a direct result of the tourist industry that we have. This is one of the reasons why, to me, it's absolutely critical that if you use a cap, you review it regularly. Things change. Cities are not static. They are dynamic living things. Neighborhoods change. They need to be reviewed regularly, just as your comprehensive plan is reviewed.
So the idea of a cap would be not all, like you're talking now about a number, what it is now, a little more or whatever, or more. Kind of went from there
I probably
to
would put a
discussion.
percentage.
Yeah, I was just going to say percentage, but percentage of what? The housing stock available now? Because we have that other issue of affordable housing.
It would be the idea that I've been working on is it is a percentage of the zones wherein VRDs are permitted as an unlimited use. In other words, you would not be adding all of the orange area into the calculations of the cap.
Could I restate that and see if I have it clear, Ron? The percentage would be, my understanding is the percentage would be a percentage of the number of lots in the city.
No, not in the city.
In the
zone.
In the zone
where it is permitted.
Whereas in the zone where it is permitted.
I should say where the zones. So you take all of those zones where it is permitted, you add up the total, and that's what would be permitted as a percentage of all of those total lots.
Ron, I'm trying to figure out how the cap process would eliminate the exposure to 49 claims. It seemed to me if I owned a VRD, it's valued as a VRD, but then when I decide to sell the property, it's no longer a VRD because the license goes away. So now the value of the property is reduced. How do we get around it?
This is one where I'm going to say that I sprung this on Richard today and sat down with him just a few hours before this meeting and said, you need to know this is going to come up. You need to know that there may be some questions. It's one that that answer is one I would actually like to bring back instead of trying to answer that right now and have a more thorough discussion. Richard could probably answer that, but it would be more helpful if he gave me the time to explain it to me to make sure that I got it down.
I can explain Measure 49 if you'd like. I'd like to step back just a second on the issue of the cap. Whenever you do any kind of land use legislation, or any legislation for that matter, you need to have a valid public purpose, means reasonably fashioned to achieve the ends, so you're not capturing too much, regulating more than what you intended. And it needs to be based upon, especially in land use, an adequate factual base. So when you say, oh, let's have a cap of 10% or 12% or 15% or whatever, that cap needs to be based on an adequate factual base. It can't be the arbitrary and capricious number we picked out of the air. Generally, that requires that you do some kind of analysis of your housing stock. In this case, if we're talking about complying with the land use goals and having the appropriate mix of residential and different types of use, you got to look at what you have and then analyze what you need. And then from that information, that adequate factual base, you can come up with a rational number and justification for. So the one thing I want to stress is that we don't just pick numbers out of the air. Right? So, and if you're going to propose something, you can run concurrently and say, we're going to impose some kind of cap, and we're doing a study to justify the cap, but the numbers lose at this point because we don't have all the information. All the information is needed.
This is, Richard's actually moved us to the next step, okay? The step, what happens next with all of this is Monday, we go to the city council and we say, do you want to initiate this process? Excuse me. If they say yes, then we initiate. We do exactly what Richard is talking about. We do the studies. We do the housing studies. We look at the state goals. We do all of those things that you have to do in land use planning. Okay, but it begins with the point of knowing where it is going to go. I don't want to do a big study to look at something like a cap if it's not of interest to anybody. Okay, so that's why the idea is out on the table. Mr. Ward.
Speaking of have all these different things that we want to be easy to understand, easy to follow, easy to enforce. I would like to add keeping it fair. And because if we don't, we'll never have even waters. And a test that I would like to use, or at least think about using, is when we're talking about an action, whether it be a cap or whether it be occupancy or whatever you want to put, let's at least have a discussion on how that helps or hinders the residential area and how that specific decision helps or hinders the VRDs, because in fact they do contribute $1.3 million a year to our economy, and over 5 years that's $6 million, and responsibly that's something that we have to think about, but not at the price of our neighborhoods, but just so it's all on board and everyone can see what the rationale was, and much more than the rationale, the intent.
I like the idea of the cap. For me, that gives the neighbors in the neighborhoods, the full-time residents, gives them something in exchange for 365 days for the VRDs. So I support that notion.
I think also that's a good idea, but I'm still looking at the map. I'm still looking at areas where it's not evenly distributed necessarily, and we still are talking about a commercial use and a residential neighborhood, and we do need to protect the residential neighborhood and understand and value what VRDs bring to the city. But I look at that east side, west side of the highway, and it just, I have a reaction to that because it's not necessarily a fair distribution of the businesses in the neighborhoods, and that's
interesting.
not fair to me.
Let me explain a little bit about how that came about. Okay, one of the arguments that I've heard over the last year is the market. Let the market decide. The market is a great determining and limiting factor, and it is. We're not going to have 6,000 VRDs. Every home is not going to be a VRD. Every VRD is not going to be able to rent 365 days. The market will determine much of that. Well, I kept hearing that. And so one of the things that I ended up asking myself is, where are the VRDs located? What has the market said is the property that is of value for VRDs? And 101 is the line. And if you follow it straight up, so it includes Roseanne, that is where the value is for the VRDs. There's less than 40 VRDs on the east side of 101. The City Council had a big discussion on what do we do about the property along the lake. Do we try to make that into a zone where it would permit it? Well, the market's already says that is not an area where they want the VRDs. There's only just a small handful. So the reason we came up with this is because that's where the market had already determined it. 178 VRDs in here. In these green areas, 178 VRDs.
But to throw in a butt there, but that's been willy-nilly. And it is up to the city to decide how and where it wants businesses to be. And we do, I think, have some say in where that is. And maybe not necessarily it all has to be in one or two neighborhoods. Maybe we say that's enough for that neighborhood, those residents. There has to be some kind of thinking about how people live their lives and livability. And right now we're saying, okay, let's have businesses and all the list of residential zones that we have here. But let's be fair about that. Okay. Let's look at the entire city. Let's see if there's too much saturation in one area. Let's think about the whole situation, not just market. So that's only one element.
I mean, you mentioned that most of the VRDs are in the R5 zone west of 101, but they're still in the minority. There are more residents that live in the R5 zones than there are VRDs, and we've got to protect those residents. And I know there are families who live in the R5 zone or west of 101 who have had properties in their family for generations, and they've used it as vacation homes, not as VRDs. But yeah, there's got to be a balance. There really has. And I think
This is where Council Board's discussion actually is really apropos. This is where we're not looking at the accessory use as the only thing. It's part of a package. Okay, we discussed some of that. Council's discussed a lot of it. You discussed a little bit of it last week, a little bit of it today. Today our focus is on where your questions were located from 2 weeks ago, and that's accessory use and occupancy. Now, let me bring up one other thing. A call I had received said, you didn't spend enough time talking about Road's Edge. You passed over it too quickly. And I said, okay, explain why you feel that way. And he said, because there's already a process to rezone Road's End. Okay, and that's true. There's already a process. That ordinance is in the process of being developed. I asked Mr. Townsend to update me on where we stand with that. Currently, as it pertains to VRDs, it's using basically the same language we have in our ordinances now. They have to be an accessory use. If that zoning goes through, then there will most certainly be some adjustments to that based upon where you guys decide you want to go. Okay, any questions on this before I move to the next topic?
Is that zoning property owner requested, or is that city requested?
The Roads and Improvement Association came to the council and asked the council to initiate the rezoning. And under the terms of the settlement, that's something the council's allowed to do if the homeowners association asks for it. So, in a way, it's initiated. Technically, it's initiated by the city, but it's at the request of the homeowners association.
Okay. Can we back up for 1 second?
Just neighborhood association. Correction, it's a neighborhood association, not homeowners association.
That's what I meant. The improvement association.
I knew it.
Just to step back. What we're talking about is a land development regulation. Okay, a land development regulation is a regulation that implements your comprehensive plan. So our comprehensive plan says we are to protect and stabilize residential areas from incompatible development. Says things like balance the tourism needs with the needs of existing residents. So we implement the comprehensive plan with our land development regulations. Our land development regulations, for purposes of VRDs, includes the accessory use limitation. So accessory use is a land development regulation because it limits the frequency, how often you can use your property as a vacation rental. Now, sometimes accessory use limits the intensity because, like for bed and breakfast, it says you can only use 2 bedrooms. That's how much. An accessory building, everybody can look at and say, well, if your garage is 6 times bigger than your house, that's not really an accessory building. So you can see that it varies, but usually there's 2 parameters: frequency, how often do you use it, and intensity, how much. There are 50 people in the VRD, or is it only 10? So, again, our comprehensive plan says protect and stabilize residential areas. Accessory use implements that comprehensive plan by limiting frequency of the commercial use to make it more compatible. Again, it's with the residential area. Occupancy, saying, and you shouldn't be allowed to have 40 people in the VRD. You should only be allowed to have 11. That's one of the suggestions. That's an example of, if you were to adopt that, that would be a land development regulation implementing a comprehensive plan. Policies is protect and stabilize through an intensity. There's some issues associated with that because occupancy, to me, is a health and safety regulation. That's another issue, and we can talk about that when we talk about Measure 49. But just so you know, and back to the cap, okay? What is the cap? The cap is really just another, maybe less precise implementation measure, because it's a cap, but as you stated, it's not going to help you in a particular neighborhood if there's too many in one particular area. It's not as precise a control to address implementing the comprehensive plan. So just think about what we're talking about in terms of they are land development regulations and they're implementing the comprehensive plan.
Ron?
Yes, please.
Now, I think a cap would actually protect neighborhoods better than incidental and subordinate use. Because incidental and subordinate use, somebody could still apply for a VRD in neighborhoods now, but if it was a cap, you're done. Everything's done. It can't be done anymore. You can't add anymore. The existing ones are already there, already dealing with it. So I think the cap is actually more protection than sticking with 30, 60, 90 days, whatever, for incidental and subordinate.
I agree if the cap was the number that we have now.
Right.
So, again, just jumping off of what Richard was talking about, every one of these that you see in these is the same thing that he was discussing. They are a city's attempt to try to do that, reach that balance, because you are talking about commercial uses and residential zones. And so all of these are an attempt
This is back up. Excuse me.
Okay.
This is the one I wanted to make sure that we ticked out, because caps and distance and density are different things.
Right.
So when you were talking about the pain, the way I see it is the more VRDs, like JFK said, raises all boats. Rising tide raises all boats. But a 6-bedroom VRD is a spike of pain for the neighbors, and that's, I think, what this Newport model is attempting to. So if you have several of these big spikes of pain right around your house, you're affected a whole lot more by the VRDs. That's what I liked about, at least what I'd like to see us consider, is that density and distance concept.
Okay, so let's move on to the next subject, and that's the occupancy. This is the other part that I wanted to try to get through tonight to get your feeling. The proposal that is before you is 2 per bedroom plus 1. Okay, now if you recall, our current ordinance kind of has 2 parts to it. If the VRD was licensed after 2010, it has a hard cap to it, and that is 16 occupants. Okay, not more than 16 occupants. Before that, they're both based upon the building standards and so forth, but before that time, it bases it solely on the size of the bedrooms. Okay, you can have 2 in a 70-square-foot bedroom. If it's larger, if you want more than that, you have to increase the size of the bedroom. Okay. This is what we found in the other communities. Manzanita is 2 per sleeping room plus 4. Newport's is 2 per bedroom plus 2 over the age of 3. They don't count under the age of 3 and under. Yachats is 2 per sleeping area plus 2, no more than 4 bedrooms. Bandon did not have restrictions. Seaside is 3 per bedroom over the age of 3. Cannon Beach is 2 per bedroom plus 2 with a maximum occupancy of 12. And Lincoln Cities is 2 per bedroom plus 1 over the age of 3.
Okay, there's a couple different things in there. Newport and others say bedroom, Yachats and Manzanita say sleeping room. And that's discussion I think that needs to happen is what are we calling it? Because some people will say that they have, let's say, 3 bedrooms, and then perhaps there's a sleeping room. But if its purpose is for people to sleep in it, then what are we calling it?
We have a game room with a bunk bed, a TV room with a sofa pull-out couch.
Well, I'm just saying, we need one word, either it's bedroom and including sleeping rooms, or sleeping rooms and including bedrooms, or bunk rooms, or whatever you want to call them.
The state of Oregon kind of got into this back in 2009, 2010, because they had rooms being created that slept lots of people, and so that's why they actually amended the code back in 2009, 2010 to impose the 16 total occupants, because they got into this, what is it, a sleeping room, a bedroom, and they just said, no, a number everybody understands. Now, you still have limitations in the 1997 housing code that we've adopted in Chapter 15 that says each person gets 70 square feet.
70 square feet for the first two and 50 for each additional person. I think the point is really important that there's a technical meaning for bedroom, and that is different from what the code calls rooms used for sleeping. So, because a bedroom's got a closet, but a room used for sleeping can be the living room with a hide-a-bed or whatever. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Well, I was going to point out that, if I remember right, Seaside does have a max. I think it's 12.
I don't think I have their ordinance in front of me. We'll check on that.
I thought we had a max bedroom as well. So we
have a max total of 16. For those after 2000.
Five bedrooms.
Oh, yes, we have a max bedroom of 5.
Of in any zone and any condition. Is that correct?
So,
period. Only residential.
A house built to residential standards can't have more than 5 bedrooms. Doesn't mean that, but you could have more rooms used for sleeping.
So a residentially built home can have 5 bedrooms, and a game room with a bunk bed, and a TV room with another bunk bed, and another room with another bunk bed.
We still get into the maximum 16-person occupancy of the 2010 and after.
2010 on, there's a firm limit, and that's 16.
So then talk about trying to keep it simple. This is not simple. If if a resident wants to know how many people can be staying at the house next door that's a BRD, what's the answer if there's 3 bedrooms?
I'll tell you, I've consistently recommended that we just say number 16, or 16 is easy to defend because you can point at the state and say, see, state. Now, if you want to adopt a number like 12 or 11, then we got to ask Seaside and these other cities, what was the adequate factual base you used to justify that number? And if we right now just say you can do what the state law allows, we reference the lodging house limitation, which is 5 bedrooms and 16. But 16 only applies if you're built after a certain date in 2010.
When they say 16, does that include people, kids under 3?
Our ordinance doesn't make that distinction, does it? It just says 16 persons.
I have to look, but I think it's just 16 occupants.
Yes.
I think it's natural persons.
I don't think we make a distinction on age.
It seemed to me that when you got families and what have you that use the VRDs, that kids under 3 shouldn't be included in that 16 because they can be anywhere. They can be sleeping in their little car seat. And that's entirely different than an adult sleeping in a bed.
Is that a safety issue now?
Sleeping in there and using the facility. I had an incidental. Can you put 16 people in a 2-bedroom house?
Yeah, I've seen it.
I was just looking at the 16. Are there circumstances where that violates our health and safety standards?
With a 5-bedroom house, that's movable.
Is there a max occupancy for commercially built homes?
What was the question?
Is there a max occupancy for commercially built VRD homes?
No.
And we don't have any.
That's my next question. Do we have any commercially built VRD homes?
No, we don't have any. There's no ceiling on it.
The VRDs in the commercial zones are built to the residential code.
They have.
They have been.
Well, that's where I'm thinking that if the bedroom size or bedroom limit's already there at 5. So for VRD limitations, I think you're right. The number should just be a number. It doesn't matter what age.
The state's lodging house limitation had like an exception, but if you were built before a certain date, the 16 doesn't apply to you. The state, when we talked to the state, they pretty much recommended just pick a number and put it in your license ordinance. Don't reference us. So if we could,
Keeps it simple.
yeah, we could do that as a health and safety regulation, not associated with implementing the comprehensive plan, just as a health and safety.
I don't see any limit to the number of people in Seaside right now.
I just say 3 persons over the age of 3 per bedroom.
They define it in the conditions of approval, but that would be specific to the number of bedrooms.
Okay, there was one other question that came up just before we started, asked that we bring that up, and that was a little more explanation of the Oregon Travelers Accommodation Rules. Okay, there's been questions about whether or not we should adopt some or all of those rules. I gave a copy to each of you. I'm not really prepared to discuss that tonight, but it is something you should review so that it can become very future discussions. Yeah, there were. When I looked through it, there definitely were some things that didn't seem to apply. There were a couple that made some sense. Vector control, the spa. The county, when they regulate the pools and spas, they do hotels, and the county is the one who's in charge of implementing the state law on this. They have said that spas are not something that they regulate, and therefore, if we wanted to do that, we would need to both come up with how to do it and who to do it. Okay, so there's much more work if that's somewhere where you guys want to go, but it was brought up and asked if I just bring it up tonight. So this gets me, Councilman.
Ron, is a spa different than a hot tub?
Is a spa different than a hot tub?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. As I think of the definition, I don't think so.
And the county does not regulate hot tubs?
In hotels, they do.
Yeah, but not a VRD.
No.
Are they audited currently? A VRD is audited in compliance at all? To see what they advertise is what is actually going on?
Well, Timothy does that, and for TRT compliance, they certainly are.
Having a vacation rental home in Sun River, it was required by the homeowners association that each time there was different people renting the unit, it was required that the hot tub had to be cleaned or sanitized. And that was part of the regulations in Sun River for hot tubs.
As I went through those, there were 2 that seemed to make some sense: the vector control and the spa. There were some that didn't seem to make any sense, but that I was going to have further discussion at a later time. But those were the main 2 topics that I wanted to discuss. Let me just talk again about what happens next. On Monday's agenda for the City Council, this will be before them, to vote on whether or not they want to initiate the process of developing the ordinance. And I will give to them as part of my staff report a comprehensive discussion of everything where we are today. Okay, all that we've discussed and where we are today. If they say go and they move to initiate it, then staff will begin the process of developing the ordinance, doing the studies that are necessary to justify whatever it has, or to see if it justifies. I don't want to give any foregone conclusions, but essentially to what Richard was talking about as far as your findings and facts and your complying with your master plan and all of that other kind of stuff. I've also already talked to the city council about giving me permission to take this on the road and start talking in some public meetings about this to explain it. And then finally we end up going through the public hearing process. This is perhaps the most important part because this is the part where you get the public input. You've been hearing from staff, and you've certainly been hearing from emails and phone calls from others, but this is really the official stage of getting public input, and I might say it's the most important stage of it because you're getting public input. This is a time when you'll hear from the people who live here, who do business here, non-VRD owners, VRD owners, all of them on how this will impact them. Earlier last year when I was going through and holding these public meetings, one of the things that I stress is what is success in land use. Land use is one of the hardest things cities do. And the reason, and it's not surprising to me that VRDs is very difficult, and it's because you're hitting people where they live and you're hitting people in their pocketbooks. Okay? If you could add children to it, you'd have the mother of all issues. But you're close. And so it's not surprising to me that this is a difficult process. The way I look at success on this is that a home run is not for people to come in and say, we just love this, because there will be things on this that everybody will say, I don't like, but it is, can we live with this? Okay? If people can come and say, we can live with this ordinance, then we've hit a home run. Okay? Because, again, it's land use. This is fun stuff to me. I enjoy it. It gives me a chance to hear how things affect people. There will always be tough questions. You guys ask tough questions. I think that's great. And so that's where we go next.
I think something else that's pretty important to a lot of people, probably should be put up the ladder, is enforcement, accountability, and reporting. That's a big issue I hear about a lot.
That's an important component. Again, we're only talking about two components tonight of a package.
Can I ask a background question? We have 500 VRDs. Does that mean all 500 of those rented their VRDs for more than 2 weeks in a year?
Don't know that.
So I guess my question is, do a lot of people have VRD licenses, but they're really not renting the VRDs? They just have the licenses in place.
This is actually interesting because it comes to the cap. Okay. One of the things that Kate found as she looked at this, it's a very interesting point, is that there is a minimum amount of revenue. If you have a cap, there's a minimum amount of revenue you have to show each year to keep your license. The reason for that is so you just don't get somebody in the neighborhood buying up the VRD licenses and not using it, and thereby stopping any kind of future growth. So it was an interesting approach they had on that.
Mr. Chairman, you dropped in a memo you authored and had an idea, and I wondered if you know the content and what you were trying to paint, the picture you were trying to paint, better than any of us. Now that you've heard Ron's idea of the cap, I find it similar. Your ideas and this cap idea, trying to get to the same issue?
I think it is. My idea was an urban usage growth boundary, and I think the substantial difference is in the unit of measure. A cap is in the number of buildings, whereas a usage growth boundary would be in the number of adult occupancy nights during the year. Adult occupancy nights being the things that actually impact both the revenue side and the pain in the neighborhood side. But I really think the cap idea is a simpler idea than mine was.
Thank you for that, Mr. Chair.
and that's what I wanted to hear, or I wanted everybody to hear it. And since you authored it, and you've spent numerous times trying to explain it to me. I wanted to make sure there weren't points missed, though, that you were honing in your.
Right. Thank you for bringing that up. In fact, when I asked to go back to the Newport Mall, it was specifically for the purpose of identifying the density and proximity elements to that plan. Because I think the density and proximity elements are the ones that sort of implement, I hate to use the word control, but management of that pain spike in a particular neighborhood or area. Did I answer your question?
Yes. If you drop stuff in to me anyway on material, I want to hear it, so thank you. And actually, okay, Ann doesn't have to do it, but it's the same thing would now flip to her, because she was kind enough to list a whole bunch of ideas and thoughts, and I don't want us missing them. And so if there was a way that you could, if you don't mind,
no, when there was a break in the action, I was going to actually ask Deanna if she would, if the room agrees, if she would go over and list those and maybe entertain questions about the points.
Sure. I don't know that I need to list them all because a lot of things haven't been talked about. The idea, though, that we haven't talked about that I am curious about, and whether or not it's in this discussion or in a different discussion, I think it has to be had, is those buildings that are now considered VRDs that are larger than or provide occupancy for more than the ones that are in the residential neighborhoods. I've been thinking about this, and I think they need a different name or a different classification, a little bit more management, perhaps. And I've said that a few times, but I don't know what others think of that. But I don't see them as the same animal as a VRD, like next door to me, for example.
Are you talking specifically about VRDs in a commercial zone?
Well, they're not all in commercial zones, but that's where they should be.
Like Bellhaven? Some of those homes in there you're talking about?
No, I don't know if they're
perhaps the mega rentals.
I mean, I don't want to point to a specific house. I'm just trying to say that there are those houses that rent as VRDs that are now called houses. That if you were to go and buy a home to live in, go to work from, send your kids to school from, that would really be a house. I guess Gene wants to say something. But so I'm just saying that that's something that hasn't, I don't think have discussed, and I think it's an important point because they aren't.
Are you talking about the sleeper houses, the big sleeper houses?
They're very big. They are.
Sorry, Kip, I didn't hear what your question was.
I was asking if she was talking about the big sleeper houses.
Big sleeper houses. I'm not.
Can you give an example of
Sleeps 40?
That would be an example of a big sleeper house. And many
more than 20?
I've been
more than 16?
Yeah. More than 16.
More than 16.
I think the question is, are these VRDs or are they lodges that house 40 or more people? And do the current VRD regulations, are they appropriate to manage these mega rentals? Or do we need another tool to do that?
Well, it doesn't matter if it's in a residential area. We have a system in place now that can't be over 16 or more than 5 bedrooms. So it doesn't matter if they sleep 40 or 400. They can only have so many people. And if they have more than that, then that's where I think we're talking about enforcement and accountability. That should stop that. And that's for a discussion to increase enforcement, to increase enforcement by maybe hiring someplace or somebody else, having one phone number instead of people contacting everybody else and nobody knows what's going on. We need to funnel it down to one place so we can figure out what the numbers are, what the problems really are, and what's really happening out there, because right now nobody has a clue.
I was just talking about size of house, but anyway.
Well, so I guess I'm looking at Strappicello. Now, I'm going to make the broad assumption that the discussion we just had is kind of a road end. It's an off-limits for a while discussion. Because I'm not sure the 5-bedroom, 16 occupancy fits that criteria that road's end.
Well, we have a current UBA appeal.
Okay.
From the Vacation Rental Appeals Board, where we had an appeal to the board saying, which was the Planning Commission sitting against the appeals board. And the appeal was, we do not want our VRD limited to 5 bedrooms. Your regulation does not apply to us. We're a 6-bedroom VRD. Now, they've appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals, and they have argued that the occupancy limits in our license ordinance are land development regulations, and that they are protected as non-conforming uses. So, an example would be Mr. Kip Ward has a hotel. The hotel is in a commercial zone. The city comes along and rezones his property to residential. His property, because it was legal at the time it became a hotel, in accordance with the laws in effect, may continue as a legal non-conforming use. The argument being made is that the occupancy limits in our license ordinance are land development regulations, and that since they were operating a VRD before they were annexed and those regulations were applied to them, they may continue to operate as they did before those regulations were applied to them. They're making the same kind of argument that those regulations don't apply. And their argument is that it's a land development regulation. Well, our argument is it's a health and safety standard. It's in the license ordinance. It was adopted not to implement the comprehensive plan, but to address the safety of the tourists and the people that go to that facility. And in fact, this is another point, that we pulled out the health and safety regulations during the 2014 discussions and said, these are too important to wait. Let's adopt them ahead of time. And since they weren't land development regulations, they didn't have to go through all the process that land development regulations had to go through. So they were adopted very early, I believe in May of 2014. Everything else got adopted in November and December. So it's an issue, not just for Road's End, but it's an issue if you want to use occupancy as a land development regulation. So if you want to implement the comprehensive plan using occupancy, you're going to run into this same non-conforming use argument.
Irregardless, I think, of where these houses are, I mean, that is part of the discussion, certainly. But when there are 20, 30, 40, or however many people over and above that limit are somewhere, my thinking is that isn't that then something else? Doesn't that require on-site manager or something? I mean, doesn't it go to another level rather than, hey, my family's coming from Portland for the week and we're going to rent this nice little house?
I considered them to be like a resort or a camp. When I first encountered these very large things, it was more like a camp or a resort that was in one giant building. So when I first looked at it, I looked at it as a land use item, and it's different than a regular VRD. But what I was talking about is, I think the best way to approach large occupancies is from the health and safety, fire life safety approach, not as a land development regulation, but as a fire life safety issue.
Could we then require or make them be built to commercial standards or retrofitted, something like that, where it's, how are you going to get 40 people out?
Yeah, I think that in a commercial zone, if you have a VRD that's built to the residential structural code, or residential specialty code. And if you, I think in order to really be safe, you probably should be.
In a commercial zone, build it to commercial standards.
So there's two issues going on. One is the zoning issue. The other is just the fire life safety. And I guess one of the things you could consider is that some of the things you've been talking about, like the tourism, tourist lodging accommodation, the hot tub regulation, that kind of stuff, that stuff's not really land use. That's fire life safety, health and safety regulations. Those don't have to go through the land use process. So you can always separate that out like was done in 2014.
As a matter of fact, what the council is going to be getting on this is that they will have land use regulations pertaining to this. They'll have other regulations that are not land use, such as Richard is talking about. Those ones that are not land use can move much quicker than the land use regulations. And if they were to say, go and put these, start putting these together on a quicker basis, we could. And quite frankly, there's even some that don't need the councils to take any action. We can just simply do them. For example, one of those is, and Commissioner Robinson was going to talk a little bit about some of the enforcement ideas we've been discussing. One of those at the heart is a call center, or in our case, it would be a dispatcher. Right now, in the BRD, they are required to have the phone number of the local contact. Okay? And if there's a problem, they call the local contact. We also give handouts, cards to the neighbors with that same information, who the local contact is and the phone number to call them. The problem with that is that in some instances it means that somebody might get 3 different cards because they have 3 different owners or 3 different contact people or 4 or however many of their neighbors. So they're having to look through and say, who do I call? The noise is coming from this guy, the noise is coming from this guy, the trash is, so they're making calls. In addition, one of the comments that I heard from many residents was, you don't really like being the policeman, okay? You don't really want to be the role of having to make these phone calls. Well, one of the things that we looked at was the idea of a call center, and where the calls for the non-guests, people who live here, have one number in which they can call and get those problems taken care of. The proposal we're suggesting is the dispatch, our own police dispatch. When a call comes in, the dispatcher will have a decision to make. Is it a life safety issue? If it is, then the police get dispatched to that. Is it more of a nuisance? Trash, for example, is it more of a nuisance? If it isn't, then an email will go to the local contact plus an email to this office. There will be a time frame, I don't know the exact time frame, in which the local contact will have to fix whatever the problem is. Okay? And then we will be required to follow up to make sure that the problem is fixed. Okay? And so that's one of the mechanisms that we're using. Part of that also then goes to a discussion on penalties. Okay? City Council had a pretty good discussion on raccoons, dogs tipping over garbage cans. Okay? That kind of stuff can happen all the time. And there's something like the Newport model. It's 3 strikes and you're out. You've lost your license. You get a warning, then 3rd-day suspension, and then you lose your license. Now, the question that they discussed is dogs happen. Dogs tip over the trash. The question is not did it happen, but did they respond to clean it up and to fix the problem? So one of the concepts that we discussed was that if there is a complaint like that, is it verifiable that it happened, and did it get fixed within a reasonable time frame? Other things that we looked at, as I mentioned, response time, noise. We have a law that's kind of consistently broken by everybody, and that's that our quiet hours actually begin at 7 p.m. And it's 50 decibels within a certain distance from the property. there was a question, there was much discussion about raising that time frame to 10 p.m. Okay. Then, of course, there was health and safety regulations that we discussed. Some of there's travelers, Oregon travelers accommodations. Yes.
I just said a couple of things. One about the noise is 7 o'clock seems pretty early for certain kinds of noises, but is there a consideration for like construction noise? I mean, this is a bigger issue than just this, but construction noise or yard maintenance, have a good blower noise, and then the other, like people laughing outside noise. I mean, can there be a consideration for the who and how the noise is being generated?
This is perhaps, I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but I can tell you my experience in noise enforcement. It's very difficult. Okay. One of the things that we most definitely need to look at is the decibel level. Okay. It's not sufficient to simply say it's noisy. Okay. If the police or if an enforcement employee goes out and actually tries to enforce the noise ordinance, they're going to have a noise meter, and it's going to have to be calibrated, because those are the things that get challenged in court. And so to enforce a noise ordinance is not an easy thing to do. It can be done, but it takes diligence in your equipment and where you're measuring from and everything else. So, the best example I always hear is that a lawnmower is louder than me speaking out on, yelling from my house, but yet yelling from my house is considered noise pollution and a lawnmower isn't. So, those are things that are really, really important when you're trying to enforce noise. Yes.
There are some jurisdictions train and use volunteers for some of that within neighborhoods, like the watch. I mean, it's not something that can't be done. And the other thing under health and safety that I think is really important is that we spend a lot of money to bring people into the city and to stay and to go shopping and do all of that. And I think that there ought to be go kits available for every person, enough for every person that's staying in the neighborhood. So it would depend on how many, but it could be by occupancy. And there are ways in which those can be monitored and secured. And I've had conversations with our emergency management person, and it seems like a good kind of thing. I just don't want to lose that, because health and safety, one of the big deals is the big one, and so we ought to be proactive.
One of the other enforcement issues is parking, which to me is actually the most difficult and the most long-term and most expensive issue. I had a fascinating experience with our staff as we were discussing this, and we asked the question, do we have a VRD parking problem, or do we have a city parking problem, of which VRDs are one contributor? The answer that came back is we have a city parking problem, of which VRDs are one contributor to it. And so part of what we will be presenting with this one is really more long-term, is our options to address parking on the streets and off the streets within the city. The one part of it we'll be going forward with is that the city right now prohibits triple stacking of cars. And it doesn't matter if your property can handle 3 cars in a row, we prohibit it. That's one that we'll be proposing to change. Thank you, sir.
I just want to say thanks staff. They put a lot of information together, a lot of time on this last 2 workshops. I really appreciate the work you guys put into it and the information we received.
Here, here.
Fantastic in helping me, so.
On our agenda items, we had the question of ownership, which I raised as just a question. I think it's probably from my own education. I've never understood the purpose for the limitation of ownership of VRDs.
And that's the guy that has been here longer than all of us.
The reason we had the limitation of ownership of one in a residential zone was based on the idea that vacation rental is somebody's second home that they're renting out when they're not using it. And it didn't make sense that someone would have more than one vacation home, or more than one second home in the same community. Might have one here, one in the desert, one in Hawaii or something, but it's unlikely they would have two or more in Lincoln City that are their second homes, that are their vacation homes. So it was reinforcing the idea that it was their second home or their vacation home, as opposed to a business.
If you look at it the other way, you go back to prior city attorneys ago, if you had two vacation homes in Lincoln City, you were violating the accessory use limit because it wasn't incidental and subordinate to your use, it was a business. So it wasn't your vacation home that you used occasionally, it was just a business.
So that sort of begs the question, if we go to unlimited occupancy or eliminate the accessory use, then what is the justification of the foundation for the limited ownership?
I think that's a good one.
I've got a question about that. If you can own more than one, and you can have a VRD and build it to commercial standards in a neighborhood, what if you were to buy 4 lots together and in fact put a hotel, a mini hotel on those 4 lots? Is that out of the realm? So
You're talking about in a commercial zone.
I'm talking about in zone you want, just monster VRDs.
The accessory use limitation was to prevent that. If you remove the accessory use limitation,
ownership limitation?
Well, accessory use and the ownership limitation, when I go back and read Chris Thomas's emails about this, it's like, we don't need to adopt an ordinance that says you can't own more than one, because accessory use is essentially saying you can only own one. Right. Nevertheless, in 2007, I think we went ahead and expressly said you can't have more than one.
Right. Now, Kip, what you were talking about, if you didn't have the limitation on single ownership, then yeah, conceivably they could have 4 or 5 VRDs right next to each other, on 4 or 5 lots with one with an office in it, for example. But you couldn't have, assuming we stay with the occupancy limits and that you can't build to commercial standards in a residential zone, you couldn't have a big commercial structure.
But you could in a commercial zone.
Could in a commercial zone, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's the point of it. And actually, I think one thing that may happen if you go down the route you're talking about is that we may see more, I guess, driving the VRD use more into commercial zones conceivably than that. Like Ocean Lake west of the highway is all commercial, and it's full of single-family homes, and conceivably some of those lots could be redeveloped as vacation rentals.
The last item on our agenda says other related items. Do you have any other related items? Anybody else want to toss out some ideas, other related items?
I have a question.
Sure.
We were talking about caps, we're talking about accessory use, yes or no, can you have accessory use and a cap? And some of these other ideas that have come, can they all be, I know it's up to the city council to ask the question and answer it, but I'm curious. If you package these ideas that have
there's no, it's not like occupancy and accessory use are mutually exclusive. Right now we have occupancy limits. Right now we have accessory use. One addresses, frequency. The occupancy limits, I believe, address health and safety. If you wanted to use occupancy to address compatibility in residential neighborhoods, you could do that. But keep in mind, it then becomes a land development regulation, and things like non-conforming use arguments will they've already started popping up. So that the cap, again, is just another means to implement the comprehensive plan if you're trying to, again, it needs to be an informed decision based upon adequate factual base. So there's no reason why you couldn't do all of it.
Could we, let's just say we grant, this is for instance, we grant everyone who's got a VRD license unlimited use, no matter the zone. Then we say there can't be any more in residential zones, and there's a 5-year limit to your VRD license. So that way it would prevent more being in residential zones unless they're in a commercial or the VR zone or that multi-use zone.
That's what I was saying earlier.
Is that a possibility?
If the cap, say the cap is 20%, and we have 20% now, there can't be any more VRDs built, changed from residential to a VRD or anything else until somebody transfer a license, and then there's a waiting list and it pops in.
I just try to protect the integrity of the residential zones.
Right, that's what I'm saying. A cap can actually protect residential better than its ordinance.
So I don't think you can put a 5-year limit or any number on the limit of the number of years that they can own that. Holy cow! If you want to buy a building, pay $400,000 for it to make it a VRD, and then at the end of 5 years, you can no longer rent that as a VRD. I think that kills it.
Well, there's a land use concept called amortization, which basically it's mostly used with small dollar items, maybe not so small anymore, but signage usually. After 10 years, your sign will no longer be allowed. It's amortized. You realize the value you put into it over a period of time. In a sense, when the council last year said, we'll offer you a 180-day settlement, and it'll go away at the time you transfer the property, that was kind of an amortization. We said, you're good at 180 days, which is at the far end of what accessory use could possibly be. A reasonable person wouldn't have thought they'd get more than half of the year. So until you sell the property, and which could be 20 or 30 years down the road, or 5 years down the road, you're okay. So it is a concept in land use to prohibit a use, but amortize the existing and allow them to live out their useful life.
But 5 years is reasonable.
5 years maybe not for a vacation rental that was built as a vacation rental. For someone that simply converted an existing house to VRD, they still have a use. Like amortize a sign, after 5 years the sign's gone, no sign. But after 5 years, you still have a residence. So, what's reasonable, how much time? Again, last year the council said it's reasonable to go to when you transfer, when you sell.
And bring back the community that had that, I forget which one it was, a 5-year Canada Beach. Again, I think clearly their message was residential. It clearly prevents you just described as not feasible for a business.
No,
and they're agreeing with you and say that's not what they were looking for.
That wasn't what I was saying. I'm saying that if I live in Portland and I want to build a vacation home and I spend $400,000 to build that thing.
Well, let me stop you right there. In Portland, you'd buy it in a commercial zone. If the law says 5-year rolls, then buy it where it belongs in a business in a commercial zone. You can do that here. You can go Riley's route and you can go do it and get all the time.
I'm not sure I'd buy that.
I'm not for a 5 year, so I'm arguing against myself. But the point being, that I can see their thinking is, not to let a businesses get started in a residential area. And by turning every 5 years, clearly it says it's not going to be a business. But as the attorney has indicated, sure, you can rent it for a while, then you go to rest, and you go to use it as a home.
And with 147 on the waiting list, they're giving them.
It may be a while, right?
Yeah, it might be 5
And
years.
that's not to say you can't rent it at all.
No.
It's just not as a VRD. You would still be able to rent it as a long-term rental to people anyway. I'm only speaking of the vacation rental part.
Well, 5 years is not set in stone either. It could be any number or whatever.
And I'm only talking about
That'd be
the
reasonable for amortization purposes.
I do think in your deliberation, it is important to recognize the significant financial impact VRDs have in our city. I think you're talking a balance, okay? There's just no getting away from two things. VRDs have an impact on residential areas. Second is the city is dependent upon the revenues that come from VRDs and hotels. So I don't think you can, when you lose that balance, one of the two is going to pay. If you go too far on the residential end and you're with the idea that you're going to somehow severely limit the VRDs from what we have or from their ability to grow, you have to recognize the financial impact that's going to have on the city. At the same time, if you just open it wide open, okay, then that is certainly going to have an impact on your residents. So it is a balancing act, and you just cannot minimize either of those two impacts in your community.
When comparing the TRT tax from motels and hotels with VRDs, what the total, what percentage comes from VRDs?
25 to 30%.
I think something else you got to be careful of too. If you do like a 5-year, say a VRD, and it's like you have to get another license for a period of time in that block, that house. But who's to say there's a residence in the middle of a bunch of homes that are not VRDs, all of a sudden applies and gets it. So sometimes that 5 years can actually not protect residential neighborhoods.
The other part that I think it's very important to recognize when you talk about finances and the impact of the TRT, and I'm going to use the whole all of the lodging industry, is that it is the only revenue we have that has the significant ability to grow. Every other revenue is rather limited on its ability to grow. It acts very much like a sales tax. The more people come here, the more money that comes to our economy, and the more money that comes to our own coffers. And so it is the only part of our budget that has a significant ability to grow. It's the most elastic revenue source we have, because it also has the ability to decrease when times are bad. But that's an important component when you are having to work the budget end of it, and you're looking down at 5-year programs. The TRT money pays for your roads. Okay? It pays for your road improvements. It pays for your police improvements. It pays for all of the marketing that we've tried to do. It's paid for many of our capital projects. It's significant, and I'm not saying that trumps the other part, but you can't minimize either of those. It's a balance. Yes.
You mentioned that how much the VRDs were of the TRT. How much was the TRT of our general budget?
You know what? I don't want to give you an inaccurate number, so I'll tell you what, I will email that information.
It was almost half.
I think it's somewhere around there.
It's creepy. You were talking about Nelscott. I heard the number that it was paying 50-some% of the Nelscott road improvements, and I thought that was really a high number. What I'm getting at is if we take that money off the board, then our property taxes go up to make the compensation, right?
Yes, but there are limitations on what you can do with your property.
But don't even, I'm sorry you even threw that out there, Gary, because nobody is talking about taking TRT away, first and foremost. Let me give you the numbers again. 25% of total is TRT from VRDs. quick math says 75% comes from the hotel industry. Thank you very much. So, I mean, let's remember where
let's put the real numbers to it. The total gross receipts from our lodging industry was $62 million in 2014. Okay, of which 25% is VRDs. Okay, $15.5 million of the total gross receipts. Now, if you believe, as economists do, that there is a multiplier effect in that, and the number that is used by the state is 1.82. So you multiply that effect by 1.82, and then you get the economic impact to the city. Now, take 62 million, multiply it by 9.5%, and that's what the city got. Take 25 million, and or whatever, 25%, 15 million, and multiply that by 9.5%, and that's what the city got from VRDs. Okay? So, again, I'm not saying that one outweighs the other, but you really are talking about a balancing act, and you can't minimize either of the impacts to the city.
It seems like it's a little bit apples and oranges here. But if we're talking about caps on the one hand, but reducing or eliminating the accessory use, doesn't that mean we all of a sudden have many more nights available for people to come into the town?
Yes.
So even if there is a cap, we're still allowing many more nights to be available for people to come into the RDs.
Well, but again, you got to go back and look at what's on the paper versus what our experience was. We have not enforced accessory use. So the lodging industry, the VRD industry, has been renting to what the market will allow anyways. Okay, because we have not actively gone out and enforced that for many, many years.
I did ask that question at one of our meetings quite a while ago. Does anybody have any notion that accessory use has limited any VRD in recent history?
To me, one of the significant problems with accessory use is that the definition is inadequate to actually conduct a VRD. Somebody calls me and they say, how many nights can I rent? And I say, you can rent as long as it's incidental and subordinate to its use. And I say, is that 30 days? Is that 90 days? Is that 180 days? Is that 335 days? Is that 320 days? And the answer is, I don't know. And I won't know until one of two things happen. Either the city defines it, or the courts define it. Okay? And so if I say, I'm going to go after you and I'm going to limit it to this number of days, and now I'm going to fine you for that. And then you go in, and then the city gets challenged. The court is then going to decide what is accessory use. And to me, that's a bad way to make public policy. So
it's also a bad way to lose revenue.
Yeah. In a way, we can't tell you what it is, but we can tell you what it isn't. Right. So that over 180 days, it's really hard to make the argument that it was accessory use. I mean, it's an impossible argument to make.
And this is not a new concept. I sent you all the council's analysis of this by email. So it's not new, and it requires land use discretionary process, which you as planning commissioners are all familiar with, in order to enforce. The question before the planning commission is 296 days incidental and subordinate to the main use? That's the question. If you can answer yes, it is incidental and subordinate, then they get to keep their license and keep their land use approval. If you say no, that's not incidental and subordinate, their land use approval and license are revoked. That's the question. That's how it comes to you.
Are the VRD licenses to the houses each given the same number of nights?
No.
No.
So
not even close.
How do I know that this house only has 30 days, that house has 90 days, and this house has 180 days? I have to keep track of which ones.
When you're the neighbor.
Yeah, when I'm the neighbor, how do I know that they're violating their VID license?
So there's a number on the license?
About 25%.
On about 25%.
And they're all over the place.
The constant is the definition in the ordinance. Some people, when they came in, gave numbers. I will rent no more than 50 to 75 days. That's how I will address the standard that it's accessory. Then if you rent 296 days, there's a pretty good argument that you're not accessory.
If it's enforced.
If it's enforced. And I'll remind you all that the criticism we had 2 years ago was that it was the city's lust for TRT revenue that led to the lack of enforcement of the accessory use limit. That's a quote.
Who said that?
I don't remember. It was.
Do you have sufficient feedback from this group to move forward?
Yep, I do.
Is there anything else, gentlemen, ladies? We're adjourned.
Thank you.